Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are. It's a great pleasure to see you, and thank you very much. So, as Sophie said, my name is David Shankland. I'm the director of the Royal Anthropological Institute, and our idea today is to give you an idea of what it might mean to study anthropology at university. I sometimes ask myself the same question. It's now nearly 40 years since I began studying anthropology, and I think already there I get the beginnings of an answer. Anthropology is the most extraordinarily varied and broad subject. I can truly say that in these decades that I've had the great privilege of being an anthropologist, no one day has been alike. The field that the subject covers is absolutely vast, from paleontology to the philosophy of ethics and society, from archaeology to social organization and politics, from religion to economics. So if you read anthropology when you go to university, I absolutely promise you that you will not only not be bored, but you will be absolutely enthralled in the enormous variety of the different courses available to you. And perhaps I can put it another way. If one thinks about most subjects, they start with something very specific and they look at that fairly exhaustively, even though they may look at something else as well eventually. So, for example, English literature really is about the study of texts. The study of languages really is about the study of languages, even though you may do a little bit about culture as well. The study of economics tries to isolate economic activity and view it in isolation from the rest of human behavior. But anthropology doesn't do this. Anthropology simply does not privilege any particular aspect of human behavior, but looks at them in relation to each other. So we look at the way that belief may be influenced by politics, the way that it may intersect with ritual, the way that it may be understood as a changing, unfolding dialogue with economics, for example. And likewise, if we're looking at the piecing together of the historical anthropology of the community, again, we would look at the multiple factors that give rise to the present day. And so another way of understanding anthropology is that we look at the relationships between things without actually wishing to say in advance which of those things we will find most important by the time that we've finished our analysis. And so you can see the enormous flexibility that this discipline opens up to us. And so you would go to university, begin to study, and by the time that you have finished your study of anthropology, you would in effect have been able to chart pretty much your own path through the complexities of human existence. What more could anybody want, truly? Well, in order to give you a better idea of this, of course, we have all the universities in the country pretty much that advertise anthropology. I would encourage you to look at all of those in turn and find out which one fits with your idea of what you want to study the best. But before we go there, we have three speakers with us today. That's Nick from the LSE, Liana from Brunel, and Simon from Oxford Brookes, who will answer your questions and explain a little bit more about the way the subject works. And as Sophie kindly said, I'll also be in the Wonder Me chat later, as will many colleagues, and you can ask us more things then if you like. And of course, if you're looking at this as the recording, which will go up after the event, please do feel free to fire your questions in the form of an email, and we will do our best to pass your queries on, or otherwise put you in contact with the right department, or of course contact them directly. So that's enough from me. Now we pass over to Nick, who will take us forward. Thank you very much indeed.
Great, well, thank you, David, and hello, everyone. Welcome to London Anthropology Day. It's fantastic to see you all here. Or I can't actually see you, so it's fantastic to have you all here. My name is Nick Long. I'm a social, psychological, and medical anthropologist based at the LSE, and it's such a privilege to be with you today. My task really is to build on what David was just saying and tell you a little bit about the subject that changed my life when I discovered it 20 years ago now, a little more than that, as a teenager growing up in the South London suburbs, never heard of anthropology, but found that it changed his life. And it's something that I do genuinely believe is the best, the most exciting, the most rewarding subject that you could possibly study, or even if you don't study it formally, for you to learn about and incorporate into your life somehow. And I want to share with you today 4 reasons why I think that is. So firstly, anthropology is engaged. And I would say it's the most engaged of all the social sciences, because anthropologists don't just learn about other people, we learn from them. We might learn from their bodies, we might learn from their remains if we're forensic anthropologists, we might learn from living alongside them and sharing in their lives. And anthropology is not a subject that reduces people to statistical trends, as a discipline like sociology can do. It doesn't reduce them to their behaviours in experiments, as psychology often does. Rather, it takes them seriously as full people, as equals that we can learn from, whoever they are and wherever they live. People like this woman, for example. Now, this woman lives with the Akha, a so-called hill tribe in northern Thailand. And Akha people are shifting cultivators. Many of them are, especially older people like this lady, are illiterate. And they're seen by many people in Thailand as primitive, backward barbarians, drug addict, opium smokers, stuck in the ways that human beings used to live before the emergence of complex state societies. So the elites of Bangkok or the middle classes of Thai cities might doubt that this lady has anything valuable to teach anyone. But by listening to her, living with her, understanding how she lives, anthropologists can learn a lot. So for example, they might discover that the Akha are illiterate because, according to their myths at least, they deliberately forgot how to read and write, because writing could be used as a tool of social control. And as they start to immerse themselves more in Akha life, they can see how everything in Akha life works to maximize individual autonomy and to prevent inequality. And from that, they might conclude that if the Akha are barbarians, they're barbarians by design. Some people have suggested they're even a kind of Southeast Asian anarchist, people whose values stand at odds with the hierarchical arrangements of lowland kingdoms. So far from being primitive or a kind of people that time forgot, they have a highly sophisticated political imagination and are actively choosing to live in the way that they think is right and will allow them to flourish. And so what we can see from this example is that through deep engagement, anthropology helps us break through reductive stereotypes, ideas of what's primitive or how human societies evolved, so that we can more fully understand the people with whom we share the world and understand people on their own terms. But the kinds of engagement that characterize anthropology also help us understand ourselves. So one of my current projects involves working with hypnotists in Indonesia. You see one of my research participants there. And in Indonesia, there's been a huge trend over the past 10 years or so of people taking short training courses in introductory hypnotherapy, as well as related fields like mesmerism and magnetism, and then either starting a career as a therapist or incorporating their hypnotic knowledge into the workplace, into the classroom, and into their everyday interactions with friends and family in the family home. Now, for me, that raises all kinds of interesting questions. It gives you a taste of the kinds of things that an anthropologist in an anthropology degree might explore when faced with a situation like this. Why is hypnosis taking off in such a big way? Why hypnosis and not other forms of psychotherapy? Especially when you consider that hypnotherapy is currently quite marginal in international psychiatry and amongst global mental health circles. What impact is the introduction and the popularization of hypnosis having on people's social relations? And to what extent is hypnosis a universal psychological phenomenon? And to what extent might the history, culture, and social organization of Indonesia, or indeed of the European and American societies where hypnosis was first made prominent, how might those social factors influence either the character of hypnotic phenomena or what gets identified as hypnosis in the first place? So those are the kinds of issues that I'm grappling with right now. I have tentative answers to some of them, but my point today is that I knew that if I wanted to properly understand those issues, I needed to get stuck in. I needed to train as a hypnotherapist myself with several of the Indonesian hypnosis boards that my interlocutors trained with. And I needed to experience being hypnotized, being mesmerized, and being magnetized. Now, I won't lie, that was initially quite a scary prospect. I'm someone who very much likes to be in control of everything around them. So the idea of surrendering to mesmerism or a trance was quite challenging. But it turned out to be exhilarating because I found that doing this research started to unlock aspects of my own body and my own self that I'd never experienced before. So the therapist that you see in this picture is a radical mesmerist. So he would gesture as if he was pushing energy towards me, and then my body would move, it would fall down, or it would swing back in the direction that he was gesturing, seemingly autonomously, automatically, of its own volition. I was aware of it, but I had no sense I was consciously controlling what was happening. My hands would start writing words without my directing what they're going to write. It's a phenomenon called automatic writing. I'd go into trance. Now, that's not to say I had to go all the way to Indonesia to have those kinds of experiences. I'm sure if I joined hypnosis circles here in the UK, I'd have had them here too. But the point is that in my everyday life, the particular path that my social world took me through, I'd never experienced anything like this. I never knew my body could do that. And I think this shows one of the great gifts of doing fieldwork and indeed studying anthropology, which is that it can really give you new knowledge about yourself, including in very fundamental ways. It can reveal how the life that you've lived so far and all of the people and institutions and choices that have shaped that life course have equipped you to see the world and to experience and inhabit the world in certain ways, but whilst foreclosing other possibilities. And as a result, it's a discipline that invites us to really think hard and make informed decisions about the paths that we're going to go on to take in our lives. And in the process, it challenges any lazy preconceptions we might have about what's a normal or a good or a satisfying way to live. And that leads on to my second point, which is that anthropology is critical. It takes nothing for granted, but rather it asks us to interrogate how the environments that we inhabit might shape the way that we live in and think about the world. And now I'm going to give you a couple of examples from biological anthropology. I mean, obviously biological anthropology is very much concerned with the ways in which environments shape our bodies, the ways in which the human being has evolved, the way in which populations adapt to different kinds of environmental pressures. I'm going to give you a slightly different example as my focal point here. So for many years, biologists studying mating behavior have claimed that male animals are naturally ardent, obsessed with sex and sexually indiscriminating. Females, by contrast, are imagined within this biological discourse to be coy and choosy, holding back until a truly impressive male specimen comes along, and this is why the male has evolved to have a kind of impressive tail feather and so forth. But in practice, biological anthropologists, particularly anthropologists looking at comparative primatology, have found that in many, many primate species, females enjoy sex. They have quite a lot of sex, and they have it with multiple partners. And in fact, that would offer evolutionary benefits. Because if you've had so much sex with so many different partners that the paternity of your offspring is uncertain, then, it's argued, you might be able to secure resources from multiple males, and that would heighten your offspring's chances of survival. So given that logic and analysis based on that finding, the question that raises is why biologists ever believed that females were universally coy. And unfortunately, the answer now seems pretty clear, which is that male researchers, male biologists, were imposing their own conservative models of gender roles and their conservative models of sexual morality onto the natural world. And of course, by doing so, they ended up naturalizing and giving the authority of science to a set of historically specific and highly problematic cultural assumptions. So studying anthropology can help you see how even seemingly objective subjects like the sciences can be heavily influenced by cultural biases. And of course, if you're interested in biology, studying it within an anthropology degree is so empowering because it allows you to pair biological knowledge with that kind of critical analysis that would come from social and cultural anthropological perspectives. And altogether, it will challenge you to identify and overcome the biases that inform your own worldview. And in the process, anthropology can help you to develop new, better ways of thinking about and understanding the world. So that in itself makes anthropology incredibly relevant. But anthropological insights can also be directly applied to practical problems. And that's because anthropological research, the process of an anthropologist going in and investigating a problem, doesn't just allow the anthropologist to be a spokesperson for the people that they're working with, but it can allow the anthropologist to discover things about people of which they themselves are not fully aware. So imagine that you were designing a sofa. And if you're designing a sofa, you want to know what features matter most to your customers. So you would probably conduct some kind of market research survey to find out. And when the answers from that survey come back, the answer is overwhelming and kind of unsurprising. The sofa needs to be comfortable to sit on. I mean, it seems to make perfect sense, doesn't it? You sit on a sofa, you want it to be comfortable. But do people actually sit on sofas? Well, IKEA, famous assemble-it-yourself furniture store, employed a team of anthropologists to spend time living with families, observing what they did with the furniture in their houses and flats and homes. And when it came to sofas, they found that sitting on the sofa was actually one of the activities that they did least. Sometimes people might lie on the sofa or slump on the sofa. They might sleep on the sofa or give the sofa to a guest to sleep on. They might sit on the floor and use the sofa as a backrest while they're playing a game console or something. But none of that got captured by market research survey, because if you ask someone directly, what do you do with your sofa? People might immediately think in the abstract of a sofa as an item to be sat on. And what anthropological research can reveal is that what people say about a sofa, or indeed what people say about anything, is not necessarily what they do. But by incorporating anthropological research that actually looks at what people do and what they value, incorporating that into the design process, it's been possible to design better sofas that better meet customers' needs. And that same principle applies to any design, whether it be for a new city or a new policy. Anthropological perspectives make the design better, and through that they can improve the world in which we live. And in fact, this past year has convinced me of that point more than ever, because as we've been faced with the COVID-19 pandemic, and as we've been faced with lockdown restrictions that have often been drawn up and implemented quite hastily, it's emergency legislation imposed in quite a crude one-size-fits-all way, anthropologists have been doing really fantastic work serving as advocates for their communities, trying to show how the measures don't quite fit those communities well enough and need to be refined, as well as doing comparative research on different ways of responding to the challenge. Looking at, for example, how the bubble system in New Zealand played out vis-a-vis the stay-at-home measures or shelter-in-place measures that were seen in the UK and in the US. And through that, they're able to ensure that governments and their scientific advisory committees can better support people through these exceptionally difficult times, can better support people's needs and social relationships, whilst collaborating with epidemiologists to ensure that they're protected from infection. And if you're interested in this, you can find out some of the ways that I and my colleagues at LSE have been tackling this. We've got a video about it on our LSE university page here, but there are also lots of fantastic resources freely available online, curated by the Society for Medical Anthropology and others. But the basic principle, the thing that makes anthropology so powerful, is that anthropology is concerned both with the very big, the very abstract, but it's also concerned with the fine-grained particularity of people's lives. And it's a discipline that will allow you to connect those two levels so that you can make sure that strategic decisions or policy interventions aren't just things that sound good but don't work in practice, but can really be tailored to try, as well as possible, to ramify through people's lives in ways that are going to be constructive rather than problematic. So I've shown you that anthropology is engaged. I've shown you that it's critical. I've shown you that it's relevant. The final thing that makes anthropology so fantastic is, as David was saying, and as I hope this whistle-stop tour of different kinds of anthropological research indicates, is that it's incredibly diverse. Because wherever there are human beings, or whenever there were human beings, there are anthropological questions to ask. So the sheer scope of the subject means that you will never get bored. And you can see that for yourself in a huge range of taster talks that are available for you through the London Anthropology Day platform that the RAI and Sophie in particular have done so fantastically in setting up. So a huge thank you to them. And I hope that you enjoy using London Anthropology Day and all of its resources to discover how engaged, critical, relevant, and diverse anthropology can be. But now it's my pleasure to hand over to my two colleagues, Liana and Simon, a social and a biological anthropologist respectively, who are going to share their insights on the different types of anthropology degree that you can study and how to decide which of those degrees is going to be the right fit for you. So thank you very much and enjoy the day.
Thanks very much, Nick, and good morning to everybody. I hope you're enjoying the day and you'll enjoy the rest of London Anthropology Day. As Nick mentioned, we come from Liana and I come from different sides of the subject. So I'm a biological anthropologist with a specialism in human evolution. And Liana, do you want to?
Yeah, and I'm a social anthropologist. Hi everyone, nice to see you or not see you, I suppose. I'm actually originally from Singapore, but my main research has been in Malaysian Borneo, where I work with a small indigenous group called the Bidayu, looking at things like conversion to Christianity, ethnic politics, experiences of development and resettlement. But I also currently lead a project on the social and political dimensions of orangutan conservation. So it's all getting a bit kind of wild and more than human in my side of the world. And I guess one of the things to maybe pick up on, from Nick's talk, which maybe Simon and I could start thinking about here, is the fact that even though anthropology is very much about studying human society and human histories, trying to understand what makes us human, there's also very often a very strong non-human element to what we're looking at. Sofas, for example, and how people might use them, orangutans and how their movements around the forests and in people's farmlands and people's fruit trees can actually shape the way people view them and respond to them and the kinds of relations that you might get on the ground. And I was wondering, Simon, if you had any thoughts on that, because obviously biological anthropology has a very strong kind of non-human and thingy element to it as well.
It does, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that I was thinking about. I mean, and much like yourself, when Nick was talking, it's one of the things that we're really interested in biological anthropology, specifically human evolution, that sort of paleoanthropological strand, is really what human even means in any sort of conventional sense. Because of course we can think in terms of humans purely being ourselves, Homo sapiens, which given the amazing advances in ancient DNA analysis over the last sort of 10, 15 years, doesn't really mean anything very much. So we know, for instance, we were interbreeding with Neanderthals, we were interbreeding with the sort of mysterious Denisovans up in Siberia. And last week was actually a bumper week for human evolution. If anyone was watching the press, you'll have noticed a couple of stories about some very old new fossils in Israel, potentially very old new fossil that was found in China, as well as ancient DNA stuff from the Denisovan cave as well. And it really makes us question these ideas about what these labels mean, which is so classic anthropology. What is human? Is it a species designation? Is it a set of behaviors? Is it a suite of the way of traits that we use to react to the world? So I think those themes sit really, really neatly.
Yeah, and I think, as you're going through London Anthropology Day and kind of meeting all these different departments, to go back to Nick's original lead-in, you will find that actually there are lots of different departments that combine biological and social aspects of anthropology in many different ways. But I guess one of the most exciting things is, having to think about what exactly it means to be human, whether social relations and social life, necessarily is only confined to humans, or whether we can actually see social relations taking place between animals, or between humans and animals, between humans and the landscape. What exactly does social life look like if it's not just confined to human beings? So I guess, as you're sort of going through the different kinds of anthropology that you might study at university, one of the things that you might want to think about a little bit is how you might possibly mix and match different approaches to anthropology in the particular departments that you're looking in. So for example, Oxford Brookes, where Simon is, has a really, really good program that gives you the chance to combine elements from both biological and social anthropology if you're interested in doing so that you get a very sort of rounded understanding of human life, but also its relations with the non-human world. You get many other places, speaking as a social anthropologist, that do sort of pure social anthropology, but that might have certain specialisms. So Exeter, for example, has a long-running interest in anthrozoology, which is sort of humans' relations with animals. Places like Reading have programs where you can combine anthropology and archaeology. That's another interesting way of kind of mixing up human, non-human elements of this degree. And places like UEA, I think, have quite a strong focus on anthropology and the environment. So one thing you might just want to think about as you're going through today is, how exactly do I want to approach this question of being human? And I think different universities will have different answers to those questions.
I think that's a really, really important point, isn't it? It's that it's so easy to think you have an idea of what anthropology is. And then hopefully today, what we'll be able to demonstrate is there are so many different ways of approaching these core questions that it's really important to spend a bit of time sort of thinking about what interests you in the subject, which university may be the best fit. It might not be one that you were thinking about before. I mean, to just think of some others. So for instance, Kent has an extremely strong focus on conservation and primates. So that incredible interaction between sort of humans and wild animals and the conflicts that can throw up. So you can do anthropology almost anywhere, as we took from Nick's great example about the sofa, which is such a lovely way of thinking about a piece of anthropology. It's not a subject which is easy to define. The old joke sort of goes, if you stick a bunch of anthropologists in the room and ask us to define the subject, you'll get an infinite number of different answers. And I think that's really crucial when you're spending time looking at university web pages, reading the prospectuses, chatting to academics in the live sessions after this part of this morning, to really just think about what interests you. And one of the things to think about, I think that's always quite important is, to what extent can the different degree programs allow you to follow your interests or develop your interests as an anthropologist as you move through the degree? So as Liana mentioned, is there a particular region you're interested in? So lots of different institutions will have a strong focus on different geographical areas. It might be country specific, it might be regionally specific. So it might be an institution has a very strong focus on, say, the anthropology of Africa, or the anthropology of South America, etc., right the way down to very, very, very specific examples where colleagues will work with particular groups in particular areas. So do think about what you're interested in and how you want to develop that sort of focus of your anthropological journey, if I can put it in such a grandiose way.
Yeah, and just to maybe add to that, there are a couple of other things that vary between different universities. So some universities, for example, will give you the chance to do joint honors. You could do sort of anthropology mixed up with, I think, religious studies or politics or environmental studies, that sort of thing. And that varies quite a lot from place to place. So, if you're not entirely sure that you want to be a pure anthropologist, although, why wouldn't you want to be a pure anthropologist? But if you're not entirely sure and you want to try and mix and match things a little bit, there are universities that give you that option. For those of you who want to really get a bit more kind of practical, real life experience of putting anthropology to use beyond the classroom, there are a number of places such as Brunel, for example, which offer work placement programs where you can actually take generally a year off, or 6 months and 6 months to go off and get some work experience, build up a kind of professional profile in a way that then benefits your own journey as an anthropologist. And there are also some institutions that offer you year abroad programs, which seems a bit of a pipe dream at the moment, but we're hopeful that in the next kind of 2 or 3 years, people will be able to travel and we'll be able to start doing Cool stuff. And, you know, obviously, if you have any questions, not so much about particular institutional arrangements, because you can go and talk to individual universities today about that, but about this sort of, you know, comparative elements of different universities, different anthropology programs, please feel free to bung them in the chat. And if you have any questions at all about anthropology, again, sorry, not the chat, the question and answer box, just throw them in. And actually, I do want to try and pick up on one that popped up during Nick's talk. And this comes from Iris Roberts, Yale Iris Roberts, possibly. Hi. And the question was actually addressed to Nick, although I think it is something that actually is very applicable to anthropology in general that maybe we can all think about. And this is really the question about, you know, what exactly makes anthropology different or significant in relation to other disciplines like geography or maybe sociology, psychology, whatever. I think the questioner gets a sense that the methodology of fieldwork is claimed by many other disciplines apart from anthropology. And the question is, you know, what exactly makes anthropology still iconic? What's special about what we do?
Shall I have a go at speaking to that, since it was addressed to me in the first place? I mean, I think it's true that fieldwork and ethnographic method is being used by other disciplines like geography and environment. And if you were doing a PhD, for example, then you could have a kind of immersive and engaged almost anthropological experience within one of those programs. And there might be differences in terms of the practicalities, the length of immersion, and with the kind of conceptual training and resources that you'd go into that study with. But I think in terms of thinking about an undergraduate degree, which is obviously the key focus here for all of you who are currently in the sixth form, or you've just finished your A-levels and you're thinking about what the next step will be, if you were doing a degree like geography and environment, then you would be engaging with some research that was based on ethnography, but also a lot of research that was based on other kinds of methods, stuff that was more statistical, stuff that was more historical in approach, whereas anthropology really foregrounds that immersion and that commitment to understanding individual stories in context all the way through. So I think a lot of it is about your sensibility and what kind of learning you find suits you and what kind of learning you find inspiring. And there might be a case for some of you to say, well, actually do have something that involves learning about societies in lots of different ways. I think this also speaks to the question that has come up about the potential benefits of doing a joint degree. If you want to learn in different ways, then doing a joint degree might be a good fit for you. But if actually what really excites you is understanding those human stories, if you're the kind of person who, when you're studying English literature, gets fascinated by the characters and the way that they're navigating all of the predicaments, and you find that kind of stuff the exciting bit, then anthropology, or at least social anthropology, is going to allow you to be engaging with that every single time. And that is what I think makes it so kind of empowering and exciting, and why I wouldn't want to have something that also meant I had to do kind of t-tests and regression analysis of trends in household income. If I wanted to understand employment relations, I want to understand what was happening actually in the front line of the relationship between the worker and the employer, and then what happens with the worker's family when they bring home the wage and they've got to decide how to spend it, and to really put empathy rather than abstraction at the heart of the inquiry. But you're quite right that an anthropological sensibility can be found in other courses and other disciplines. And so I hope if any of you decide that actually an anthropology degree is not quite right for you, that this day and your exploration of anthropology will still allow you to bring anthropological perspectives into whatever it is that you do decide to study. So I think that would be my answer. Simon, Liana, do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good answer. I mean, it was good that you flagged up sort of social anthropology, Nick, because what flashes into my mind, of course, and it's an interesting distinction, I think, between the two sides of the subjects. And bear in mind, you know, the differences between social and biological anthropologists probably aren't as great as we sometimes like to make out. We're interested in the same questions, but when I'm sort of working in the field, my experience is the absolute opposite. So when I'm off looking for ancient DNA samples of disease, I'm working closely with archaeologists. We're working with physicists who specialize in working out how old the various layers of archaeological sediment are. We have anatomists. You know, it's a very, very sort of team focused approach. But still, as the biological anthropologists there, we're interested in those same questions. So one sort of nice example would be there's a really interesting cave site in Israel called Kezem, which is 400,000 years old, and it's probably, and this is a lovely anthropological theme, it's probably the first time we can identify the beginnings of the importance of if I can call it home, because we have a central point where people are bringing meat back, they're cooking it, they're storing meat, they're actually heat treating long bones to preserve the bone marrow. So recognizably, we're 400,000 years ago in a group of hominins that aren't necessarily us, they're very similar. We're seeing these behaviors that if any of us walked into that room or that cave, we would recognize as incredibly human. And it's only through that sort of very collaborative approach with archaeologists, dating specialists, physicists, geologists, geomorphologists, etc., that we can tease out these sort of really interesting sort of patterns from the past. And I think to go back to that idea of joint degrees, I mean, I think that can be a brilliant way to sort of help you focus your ideas. So if you're interested certainly on the more sort of biological side, geography is a very popular combination with sort of more biological anthropologically themed degrees, etc. And there have been several sort of questions popping up in the box about, you know, this idea or the strength of combining degrees, and it can be a very, very popular combination. Again, I would just urge you all to really sort of just speak to the universities themselves, find out how the combination works. Is it actually very integrated, or is it two very sort of standalone siloed processes? And you know, you'll find both. And I think the strongest combinations come where the degrees have actually been really sort of designed, that the modules, the papers you take really have thought about that progression as you move through, so that it gives you that really strong understanding of two sides of a subject, which, you know, as an anthropologist can only help you sort of develop those ideas about what it means to be human. There was one quick question on ethics which I just wanted to pick up, and I'm sure Liana and Nick will also have.
Before you do, Simon, can I quickly intervene on joint degrees, just because I want to flag that sometimes I've met sixth formers who think that the only way they can study multiple disciplines is by studying a joint degree. But actually there are quite a lot of single honours degrees that still allow opportunities for taking papers in outside disciplines throughout your degree. So for example, the LSE has a single honours social anthropology degree, but every single year of your degree you can take an outside option in a different subject, and it doesn't have to be the same subject every time. It can evolve, so you might start with history but then move on to gender studies and then finally do something in a language or literature. So don't always think that the joint degree is the thing that gives you most flexibility. Sometimes paradoxically, the single honours degree actually gives you more flexibility for deciding what you're going to do once you're there. So it really is worth thinking about the precise course content rather than the label, because labels do get constructed to try and appeal to a market. So really look at what it is that you're signing up to. So it's not to say that a joint honours degree is bad, or that a single honours degree is bad, but just sometimes actually the single honours degree offers all the benefits of a joint honours degree and more.
That's a really good point. I just wanted to pick up on an ethics question, which I think is quite an interesting one. And it's something that's really central to everything we do as anthropologists. And the question was from Katrine: how do anthropologists make fieldwork ethical? Do people act differently if they know they're being studied? And I think there's two questions there. I think inevitably people do act differently if they know they're being studied, depending on the type of study. But in terms of the ethics, everything that anthropologists do is incredibly informed by the ethical considerations of what we're doing, where we're going, and who we're working with. So to give you one sort of quick example from my practice, I work with a colleague in Namibia, and we have a long-running project with the San at the Sumkwe Conservancy, and it's a project that we designed from the ground up. So we work with the local people. We went out long before we actually started doing any research, just to sort of to meet people, to chat, to ask about what they found, what they found interesting. We talked about the ideas of our research project, and we actually edited that process with them long before we applied for the ethical permissions that we have to have from our own home institutions, as well as ethical permission from host governments and then local regional governments, all the way down to the actual conservancy itself. And it's one of the things that we the anthropologists have led the way on really is making sure that we actually have people from the local communities we work with who are authors on the paper, so they actually have agency in guiding the research. It's not the case that anthropologists, as unfortunately they would have done, you know, in the past 60, 70 years ago, where people just dropped in, did their research and wandered off. You know, it's much more integrated now, and that there's a strong focus on making sure that local communities have agency in the research and the results of those research. And I'm sure Nick and Liana have got similar.
Yeah, absolutely. Having said that, though, I think it is worth saying that, you know, sometimes we also have to acknowledge that our kind of analytical anthropological questions may not necessarily be the same as the questions and concerns that people that we work with necessarily have. And they don't have to be conflicting, but, you know, so just to give you an example from my work in Borneo, many people that I worked with for my PhD were very interested in trying to record and to save and to keep, as they said, the old rituals, which are disappearing very quickly because of Christianity and conversion. And so that was kind of their priority. How do we, you know, preserve these things? How do we make sure that people don't forget about them, but somehow keep them in a way that's acceptable to Christian practice? It was a very sort of complicated ethical question that was going on at the time. My analytical question was, how are people adapting to processes of religious change and cultural revitalization as a result of conversion to Christianity, right? So they're slightly different questions, and very often the sorts of, you know, the publications that I wrote were much more kind of orientated towards that. But there were two things that I did. One of them was, you know, in terms of ethical permissions and stuff. When I began fieldwork, it was very much a question of, you know, what do you want to get out of what I'm doing here? I'm here as a student of your culture. What can I help you with? What can I do for you? What do you want when I finish living with you for this, you know, 15 months or whatever it was? And a lot of it was, okay, help us to capture this stuff, put this down on record, give us DVDs. This was DVDs at the time, DVDs, books, articles, any sort of written record that you can of our old rituals. And it's really useful in the sense that, you know, I'm now finding children of the people that I worked with coming back and saying, hey, have you got a record of that ritual which you recorded, you know, like 15 years ago? Or do you still have details on what's going on in this particular area? Because I really want to find out. And, you know, nobody's around now to answer these questions. So that's a kind of, it's an academic output, but it's not necessarily a publication. My publications look slightly different. And the way that I made sure that these publications were not misrepresenting the people that I worked with was that I would then go back to them and say, okay, look, I'm writing about this stuff. I'm going to paraphrase it as much as I can. And obviously I'm going to be using a different academic language and speaking to a different academic audience, but does this make sense? Am I misrepresenting anything? Have I got it right? And so you then have a bit of a back and forth. And I think this has become much more of an accepted, you know, ethical precept in a lot of anthropology today, which is really important. You know, what exactly you're doing with your research really matters, because now, unlike in the past, it's not just you and other anthropologists who are reading this stuff or looking at this stuff. You know, you very often find that you're producing knowledge for the people that you're working with at the same time, even though this may not necessarily take a kind of academic form. And what we're also finding increasingly now, which Simon has also touched on, is that there's much more of an effort to co-design and co-create research projects from the very beginning, and, you know, kind of going to people that you might be interested in working with. And very often they're people that you're familiar with. There's much more of a trend of doing anthropology at home, or anthropology in sort of familiar places that you've already got a connection with as well, and saying, well, what do you want to find out? What's going to be useful for you? You know, how can we work together to design a kind of funding proposal? So things are changing. We've had a bit of a patchy legacy as a discipline, but I think, you know, many anthropologists have been working for a long time to try to rectify some of those problems.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I would just add that the nature of anthropological research, which involves long, immersive time spent with communities and with research participants, makes this kind of negotiation and exploration much easier. It allows for dialogue and allows for voices to respond to each other. And, you know, sometimes we can say things that people might not completely agree with, but in the same way that a friend might say something that you don't completely agree with, but then you have a conversation about it. And that's all part of the experience of doing anthropological research. And while there's always going to be kind of sensitivities in representing other people's lives, or drawing conclusions about other people's lives, interpreting other people's lives, the way that anthropology goes about it, I think, is much more ethical than many other social sciences, which would just abstract data decontextualized, or look at what someone did for a few minutes in a lab, or take some kind of blog post or tweet written by one person purporting to represent the voice of a community and then making a kind of pronouncement on the basis of that. Like, we can really see the complexity and make sure that that nuance comes through in our accounts. So I think comparatively, I think anthropology now actually, and maybe for a long time, has handled these ethical things better than many other social sciences, and many of the ethical quandaries are intrinsic to social science rather than anthropology specifically.
Absolutely. We have another question, which I think is quite an interesting one, which often causes quite a lot of confusion from anonymous attendee, which seems to be one of the most common names this morning, which is there a major difference between the science degrees or the arts degrees? And that's a peculiarity of the sort of the British system, really, I guess. In some places, for instance, Cambridge, you can only get a Bachelor of Arts degree, regardless if you're doing medicine, chemistry, anthropology, English. In other institutions, they will use BA or BSc almost interchangeably. Again, it goes back to looking at the nature of the course you want to do. Whether you get a BSc or a BA at the end largely doesn't matter particularly. So it's not something to get particularly hung up on. You know, I think it's one of the most annoying things that people often think a BSc somehow has more value than a BA. And it goes to the sort of the stuff that it's in the press a lot at the moment about the value being placed on STEM degrees. And what I would strongly argue, and I'm sure Liana and Nick would agree with me, is it's the skills you get as an anthropologist, which is the thing that is absolutely crucial and what makes you employable at the end. You know, being able to go and actually think about these questions anthropologically, and it can be, as Liana does, looking about things like conservation. It could be Nick's sort of practice looking at questions of hypnosis, or it could be my stuff looking at, you know, evolution of viruses. It doesn't matter. It's the approach we bring to these things, and that's what makes you ultimately employable. And on that, just sorry, as a slight aside, anthropologists are everywhere. You don't necessarily need to think in terms of I will go and get a job that says I am an anthropologist, but the skills you bring. So you'll find anthropologists embedded in industry, in the military, in government, in research institutions, in NGOs, in conservation. You know, it really is one of those degrees that gives you the skills to think about problems, and that's what's ultimately so valuable, and I think why we all enjoy being anthropologists.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe this kind of brings us to Leo's question as well, about whether actually undertaking a work placement is worth it. I would say it probably is, depending on your particular situation and the kind of work placement that you want to undertake. So I think the main thing to emphasize is that you don't need to do a work placement to be employable. You know, as Simon's just said, there are many, many skills that you can pick up from doing an anthropology degree that are not necessarily tied to specific workplaces or specific vocations, but that you can just bring to any career, any field. You know, analytical skills, writing skills, critical thought, translation skills, awareness of cultural difference. I mean, these are really, really major skills that employers really value today. And the question is how, you know, you can bring them to your chosen career path. Having said that, there are some universities that will offer you a work placement option. Brunel is one of them, and I was work placements convener at Brunel for a few years. And I found this a really, really rewarding aspect of the course. And we often found that some of our absolute best results came from students who undertook work placement options. And I think this was partly because work placements were really a way of giving students a chance to put into practice all the stuff that they were learning in the classroom in a way that they may not have been able to if they were just sticking with a sort of regular, you know, 3-year degree. So at Brunel, we have both a thin sandwich and thick sandwich option. Thin sandwich is where you take 6 months off and then another 6 months off at different points of a 4-year degree. Thick sandwich is where you take a whole year off. And what would happen was that our students would go to a whole range of places. There wasn't a kind of set kind of placement that you had to do. What we did find, surprise, surprise, was that most of our students didn't go into office work. They were often using this chance, you know, they'd sort of save up and go and work with an NGO overseas. They'd volunteer as an English teacher and try and do a little bit of research on the side. But the other interesting thing was that we had a lot of students who worked at home, who used this opportunity to actually, you know, get work placement experience with charities, for example. And a number of our students actually ended up being offered jobs off the back of those placements. They kind of used them as the basis of their dissertation research. They worked really, really hard at building up relationships and, you know, trying to understand what was going on in these places, trying to bring their own anthropological skills to the work of these organizations. And a couple of them actually did get contacted after they left and said, look, we really liked what you were doing. with your anthropology degree, with your skills, would you like to join us on a more permanent basis? So it can really sort of pay off in terms of, giving you a foot in that professional door. And obviously the chance to just sort of build up your CV, to get some experience of working in a more professional setting, communicating professionally, working with colleagues, dealing with bureaucracy, time management, all that stuff can be extremely helpful. So I'd say it's absolutely worth it if you're able to make it work for you in terms of finance and the time you've got available. This may not work for everyone, obviously, but it has paid dividends for many of our students.
There's a great question that's been posted about reading and preparation for applying for an anthropology degree going beyond today. The question reads, anthropology is a fast developing discipline with many turns in its theories. As a newcomer to the subject, should I start by reading Durkheim or Malinowski or Levi-Strauss, or should I first read the monographs published recently with very different theoretical frameworks and new trends? Perhaps I should read both, but time is quite limited. And you're quite right, time is limited, and no one would expect you to have read everything in advance of applying for a degree. I mean, the degree gives you the opportunity to dabble in everything, and even then you won't have time to read it all. So don't feel that you have to do absolutely everything. I mean, I would say, most importantly, be led by your interests. So if your fascination is with the kind of work that Levi-Strauss was doing, or understanding that historical moment in anthropology, then go with that. If there's a monograph that is very recent, or even published 20 years ago, that speaks to a topic that you find really fascinating, then read that and let your interests lead your engagement with the discipline, rather than feeling that there's a kind of box that you ought to tick. That having been said, I think there probably is some value in touching base with more contemporary discussions, because that will give you a flavour of the kinds of perspectives and the kinds of debates that are likely to be at the forefront of your degree. I mean, the kind of Malinowski approach or the Levi-Strauss approach, you'll cover it because it's part of the intellectual history of the discipline. It informs things that have happened since, but it's not the bread and butter of the kind of analysis that you'll be doing in your degree. So to let yourself know what you'll be exploring, some more recent stuff would be helpful. And this is precisely where the free access to Anthropology Today that the RAI is offering as a kind of gift to you for attending this event is a really fantastic way of taking the pulse of contemporary anthropology. You've got short articles informed by anthropologists who are writing now, speaking to a range of contemporary issues, and that'll give you a sense of the kinds of debates and explorations and ideas that anthropologists have, and the sorts of things that you'd be developing explorations of in greater depth within the context of a degree program. So I would really say be led by your interests, but take advantage of the resources that are available through the RAI and at London Anthropology Day itself to help guide you. All the universities will have suggestions of texts that they would recommend for introductory reading as well.
Hannah's got a question, I think, which is absolutely brilliant. It's a really interesting question, and I'm sure we're probably going to have 3 different views on this one. Hannah's asked, does social anthropology involve the study of ancient historical societies and how humans develop culturally, or is it more focused on current societies? And I think this is where it starts to get quite interesting, if not a bit complicated. So biological anthropology, when we're thinking in terms of human evolution, absolutely does that. And the methods we use are very often pretty much social anthropology. Likewise, archaeologists also do this, and again, using techniques that you'll find straight out of the social anthropology and biological anthropology sort of technique manual, if you want. So it's one of those things where the subjects really do intersect quite a lot, and you'll often find bios doing social anthropology, you'll find socials using biological techniques, and you'll use archaeologists. We use all of these techniques, so it can get very sort of intersectional, if you want. And again, I think the answer is really, if that's something you're particularly interested in, there are institutions that have a strong focus on that particular area, and there are colleagues that that research and teach on that very specifically. So again, it's something to sort of ask in the breakout sessions, look at the university's websites. But it's a really nice example, I think, which is why I like the question so much, of why anthropology is not an easy subject to define. We don't all sit in our little boxes. That's a perfect example of the breadth of the subject.
Yeah, I think there is a sort of difference in terms of methods, right? So, you know, I think in some ways biological anthropologists might be slightly better equipped than social anthropologists to kind of look at, you know, a lot of this sort of more ancient stuff. But having said that, you know, I think while it's probably true to say that social anthropologists tend to focus on studying contemporary societies, it's really important to add that we need to be very, very aware of the sort of historical and even, I mean, in some ways, geological, you know, I'm talking like really big, deep time type perspectives of the situations that we're studying, right? So one of the things that that many social anthropologists are talking about at the moment is this thing called the Anthropocene. Some of you may have heard of this. It's the proposed name for a new planetary epoch that basically acknowledges the fact that human activities have had a disproportionate impact on shaping the way planetary processes and boundaries, you know, sort of safe boundaries for planetary operations work. So you know, humankind has basically been portrayed as the dominant force on the planet these days. And when you start taking that sort of perspective, then you need to start thinking about human society in kind of planetary time and planetary terms. And you need to start thinking, for example, about, you know, how maybe human migration patterns in response to changing climates, for example, millennia ago might actually be shaping the way humans are living and interacting in today's society. There's been some really interesting work, for example, by one of our colleagues, Richard Irvine, who's up in St. Andrews, who talks about taking this sort of deep time perspective on various parts of the UK, for example. He's looked at the fenlands of East Anglia as one example of how actually human environment interactions are not just taking place in the present, they've also been shaped by years and years and years of geological you know, of various sorts of environmental processes that make a huge difference to the way people relate to the landscape today. So, you know, I think it's also a question of how far back you want to reach and what sorts of different resources and methods and scales you might want to think on. And yeah, that's perfectly fine. You can kind of mix and match things.
Absolutely. And B has asked a question: how much does modern history come into anthropology, for example, World War I and II or Victorian England? And I would say actually very much. Like a key aspect of social anthropology is to understand how historical processes that have occurred, you know, over the past century or centuries shape the worlds that we live in now and the lives that people have. So that would involve things like traumas of wartime occupation, including in World War II. That's influenced some of my own research, where there are still stories about what happened when the Japanese invaded Indonesia and how that has led to traumas that manifest itself in hauntings that afflict people in the town. So if you're wanting to understand these ghost stories, you need to understand the kind of cosmology of ghosts and more kind of like religious and belief kind of anthropology, but you also need to understand what actually happened in the history and what were the events that occurred that maybe couldn't be spoken of other than through these kind of narratives of haunting, because the collaborations and the betrayals were too kind of sensitive or difficult to articulate in other ways. Looking at how processes of imperial expansion and then subsequent campaigns for nationalism and revolution set up particular kinds of state structure and political dynamics in the post-colonial world is absolutely crucial to a lot of work that anthropologists are doing. Thinking about how patterns of industrialization and post-industrialization are playing out. It's very relevant to a lot of work that's been done by anthropologists working in parts of previously industrial England, in Yorkshire, for example. So there's a lot of focus in understanding that trajectory. So you wouldn't necessarily be looking at Victorian England, say, in and of itself, purely in its own right, but you would be looking at it in that longue durée of understanding how what was happening in Victorian England connects up to what happened in early 20th century England, and then late 20th century England, and now contemporary England. So there is scope for modern history to come a lot into anthropology. And again, if you want to augment that, then within almost all anthropology degrees, you'd have scope to take some outside papers in history that would allow you to kind of deepen your historical skills and knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I should say that my first degree was actually in modern history. So, I mean, this was modern history in Oxford. So modern history in Oxford basically means you start at about 1 AD and then kind of work your way forwards. But, you know, it was basically, you know, it was a historical perspective that in a strange way drew me to anthropology, because it sort of, it forced me to think a little bit about, or try to project myself into the shoes of people who just seemed radically different to the way people lived in the present. You know, how did people in the past understand what was going on here and there? How could we make sense of the kinds of decisions that they made and so on? And yeah, I mean, just to add to Nick's point, you know, I was talking to somebody the other day, and we're thinking about how actually what's happening in the current COVID world, and how you've got these vastly uneven rates of, you know, vaccinations in different parts of the world, in many ways map onto older colonial divides, where you've got this, you know, people in the global north getting vaccinated, you know, being relatively sort of safe and healthy. And then many other parts of the world that were historically under colonial rule, really struggling to get vaccinations, you know, struggling with conspiracy theories, struggling with all sorts of things. And in many ways, that is a sort of legacy of the kinds of global inequalities that were set in motion during the colonial era, that have kind of persisted economically and now in terms of COVID into the present day. And so it's really important to sort of keep that historical perspective, I think, in anthropology.
I mean, I think the other thing that jumps out for me from the historical perspective, from a sort of more bio side, of course, is we can look at things like patterns of disease and injury in skeletal material, and we can pick out these historical trends that map on really closely to some of the stuff we have from historical sources. So if you think about perhaps the Beyond the Plague project in Cambridge, or people studying sort of the impact of the Industrial Revolution on people in London, you get these incredible patterns that can sort of sit alongside and really inform these sort of questions about what was happening in more recent history. And of course, we must mention our forensic anthropological colleagues who work on absolutely modern materials. So the RAI has sort of really led on the development of a professional register for forensic anthropology in the United Kingdom. And, you know, we have colleagues working on modern disasters, modern sort of samples of data where they're producing information on what's happened, you know, 3-4 years ago, if not more recently. So it's certainly a subject which isn't doomed to just studying one particular area. Again, it goes back to that point about there are many ways to be an anthropologist.
Can I catapult us into the future, or the present anyway, and answer a question from Jay Marsh, who wants to know about how anthropology has changed in terms of our relationship to technology. So, for example, digital ethnography. You know, how common is this? Jay has only managed to come across digital ethnography mentioned by Daniel Miller, who is obviously a kind of sort of pioneering anthropologist in this field. He and his colleagues were among the very first to kind of spot the fact that the internet was big. It was sort of changing people's lives, and it was really worth studying in all sorts of ways. So absolutely, you know, look up Daniel Miller's work, because it's really, he's done so much stuff on the internet, on social media, smartphones, loads of stuff that is very accessible and very interesting. I think digital ethnography, you know, just anthropological engagements with virtual digital methods is absolutely central to the discipline. And what I think it's doing really is forcing anthropologists to kind of shed one of our oldest preconceptions of what proper fieldwork and proper research involves, which is you got to go and transport yourself to some desert island far away and plonk yourself in a space for more than a year and immerse yourself, and that's the only way you can do proper fieldwork. That's not true anymore. You know, everyone is sort of networked. Well, not everyone, but many people are networked. There are entire interactions and worlds and sort of social realities taking place in the virtual sphere, and we have to engage with it as anthropologists. And, you know, as Miller and his colleagues often emphasize, these aren't kind of sealed off worlds unless they deliberately want to be. Most of the time, they are basically extensions of our own social lives, and, you know, offline and offline just keep feeding into each other. So there's lots I could say. What I would say is, if you're interested in digital anthropology, you know, don't run away from it. This is absolutely crucial. This is the way we are doing anthropology much more today, especially in times of COVID. Look at Daniel Miller's work. Look at this. There's been a lot of work, for example, on the role of social media in facilitating social movements and protests. You know, some of the earliest work was done by Jeffrey Juris, who looked at the Occupy hashtag back in 2010, 2011 or thereabouts. John Postel is another anthropologist who's written a lot on the use of social media in protest movements, various social movements. There are a number of anthropologists like Tom Belstorff, who's written on virtual worlds. So he did this pioneering anthropology of was it called? Second Life, I think, way back in kind of 2008, when it was a thing, right? And that was a kind of whole virtual world that, you know, you could kind of create a second life in, I guess. And there's also been some really interesting recent work done, for example, by Crystal Abedin on social media influencers and these sorts of micro celebrities on Instagram and stuff. So there's a lot of stuff going on out there, you know, and it's not just topical. We aren't just studying the internet, we're also using the internet. I talk to my friends in Borneo all the time over WhatsApp and Facebook now because, you know, this enterprising mobile phone company went and put a mobile phone mast up in the hills where they live. So I can actually talk to them, which is great. And it sort of extends my field site in a way. It extends what I understand as field work. So yes, really crucial stuff. Don't run away from it. This is the present and future of anthropology.
Absolutely, and what I would add is that not all digital anthropology necessarily has to label itself as digital anthropology. So there might be things that specifically investigate social media, but so much of our lives involve social media that you can read about social media dynamics when you're reading something about family relations or migration or about therapy. I mean, the hypnotherapists that I've worked with are often giving therapy to clients over WhatsApp. So I might not publish it as an ethnography of WhatsApp, I publish it as an ethnography of a therapy, but the engagement with the digital is there. So don't feel that you have to find something that calls itself digital anthropology to be doing digital anthropology. I would say it's sort of become intrinsic to most contemporary fieldwork. There's a question that came in from Beatrix that I would like to just speak to, who asks about careers. What kinds of careers with a degree of social anthropology specifically, she asks, although Simon, you could maybe talk to biological anthropology as well, because I'm sure people would be very interested. And what kind of skills will a student be benefited with by studying social anthropology? And what I would say is that as I was saying in my talk, social anthropology, and I say anthropology in general, gives you that ability to look at the abstract and the general and the strategic and the theoretical and the fine-grained and the particular. And it really allows you to connect the two up in a way that can be really valuable for a whole set of careers. Also, many degrees in social anthropology will equip you with research methods. You'll learn how to do ethnography. You'll have experience of doing your own ethnographic project. And that's something that you can use in all kinds of careers, whether it be a designated research role or just applying that sensibility in practice. So to give examples of what some of my own students have gone into, many students have gone into fields like recruitment, and they've been selected by people in recruitment consultancies because they've said, actually, it was the anthropologist who could look at what this organization needed in terms of a leader or an appointment, and then find the person who had the skills and the values that would be the good fit. And because of their ethnographic understanding of what mattered on the ground, they were better at it than someone who'd done management or employment relations. People might go into a kind of policy role. So I have a friend who graduated from anthropology who now works for Newham Council, and he is recruiting anthropologists to give advice on how the council can be better supporting housing policy, because now with austerity cuts, what is the council's role? It's shifted to become more of a support network, but they need to work out with the resources that they have, what can they do and what is going to make the difference? And anthropology can help with that. Facebook, I heard at the weekend, is employing anthropologists to work with them to combat disinformation campaigns, to try and identify how do certain kinds of stories or pieces of fake news become compelling to people, how can they develop filters or moderation processes that can deal with that. So there are all kinds of ways in which anthropologists' knowledge of how things play out in practice and their ability to find that can be really valuable. I had another student who ended up working for a management consultancy. She did all kinds of management consultancy work, but because she'd done an anthropology degree, she was tasked with investigating how could you create a public health campaign that will encourage Black men in London to get HIV tests at a time when that was a demographic that had a very low uptake of HIV tests, and to kind of work out, well, what was it that was leading to that lower uptake, and what did any kind of campaign or intervention need to do. So employers recognize the value of anthropology, specifically the way it can help you understand people's lives. And even if you're doing something like you don't need to be an anthropologist to be, say, a primary school teacher, but being an anthropologist will help you understand how to support your pupils in very particular ways, because you'll have an appreciation of how to understand their world and their context and their social relationships. So it can be incredibly useful both in direct and indirect application.
I mean, I would just echo everything Nick said, really, for biological anthropology. You know, the skills that you develop, perhaps bio is slightly more focused on empirical data, but it really does come down to that point about understanding people and being able to apply those skill sets. You know, perhaps socially it's in one particular way, but in bio, as I say, it's perhaps a tiny bit more empirical. But it's the way of thinking which is so crucial, and that's the skill set you get from being an anthropologist. You know, Nick, Liana, and I all do very, very different kinds of research, but we're all driven by the same sort of fundamental fascination with what it means to be human. And there are a million different ways to be an anthropologist, but it's those sort of initial sort of skills you develop as an undergraduate that really allow you to take it off and to develop it into a million different directions. And I think that's the strength of anthropology as a subject, and why we're all so passionate about it as anthropologists. So as you do spend the second part of this morning going and chatting to colleagues at the different universities, you know, ask questions, you know, ask about, you know, why did you want to be an anthropologist? What does your university offer? What will it allow me to do? And, you know, don't be afraid to ask us questions. You know, if you ask us why we're interested in the subject, we will give you very detailed, very long answers, I'm sure. So, you know, do use this opportunity to chat to us. And as I think David or perhaps Sophie mentioned earlier, you know, if you don't get the chance to answer your question today, email the relevant university. You'll be able to find almost all of our contact details on the websites. And, you know, don't be afraid to ask academics questions. We like answering questions about the subject, and, you know, don't be afraid to get in contact with us.
I mean, just on that, I just want to very quickly sort of address a concern that Yale sort of raised, which is this question of to what extent anthropology is a sort of discipline that's really for privileged or elite people. I think that's something that may have been true about academia in general, you know, about 50, 60 years ago. It's something that we're working very, very hard to get round, to sort of move away from. I mean, you know, looking at the faces on screen, I don't think any of us had particularly kind of privileged upbringings, as far as I know. You know, and there's a huge variety of students who do degrees. At Brunel, for example, a significant proportion of our students are actually from the local area, sometimes first in their family to go to university. You know, and many of them actually find that anthropology does change their lives. In terms of the cost, fieldwork can be costly, it's true. Some departments may offer a certain amount, very small amount of financial aid. I'm not 100% sure of this. Most of our students at Brunel who have done work placements or fieldwork are also working part-time. So what we do, you know, with the thin sandwich programs, for example, they work, save up, do their 6 months, work, save up, do their 6 months, and that is permitted, including for international students. So I think there are various ways of getting around it, and you know, I think there are often routes that you can take to find ways of making your fieldwork feasible. I mean, many people do fieldwork at home, and that's perfectly fine. Some people find kind of paid placement opportunities overseas. That works out too. So, you know, obviously be practical about it. I know it's the cost is quite a significant concern for many people, and I completely understand that. But at the same time, you know, maybe don't get scared off by tales of elitism and kind of privileged people, because I just don't think that's true anymore in most universities today. And we're working very, very hard to make sure that those legacies don't persist in our teaching and your degree experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And every university will have fantastic access programs that will make financial support available for students who need it. So do look at the university admissions pages for institutions that you're interested in studying it at, to see what kinds of support you can get. And in a sense, it becomes a kind of self-perpetuating thing, that if there's a perception that anthropology or university in general is only for elites, then it will continue to be only for elites. So, I mean, I would say any kind of academic study is itself a privilege. With it comes responsibilities, but get involved and be the change that you want to see. And we will be with you every step of the way. that's maybe a nice note to wind things up on, since it's now almost past. So I think we now hand over back to Sophie.
Yeah, so that's a good place to end on our discussion. And the drop-in sessions start at 11:30. So if you'd like to have a break and then go to any of them that you'd like to go to, and yeah, think of any questions that you have, ask questions specific to the individual university courses. That's the opportunity to do that. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed our discussion. And if anyone has any last minute technical questions or questions about the drop-in sessions, just pop them in the chat and we will answer them. And Hanine has also just popped in the chat a link to our Wonder Me space, which is at 1:30. And this is an opportunity to have a chat about you can chat to us from the RAI and other people about anthropology and speak to each other as well, because obviously it's been a reasonably anonymous day for all of our attendees, but we'd love to get to know you and love to hear what you want to know about and things like that. So yeah, thank you for coming, and yeah, let us know if you have any issues, or email the London Anthropology Day at gmail.com if you have any technical problems this afternoon. Yeah, well, thanks everyone for saying thank you in the chats. Great. And yeah, thank you to our speakers who've done a wonderful job.
Thank you, and thanks for all the great questions, everyone.
Yeah, we've got questions.
Enjoy the rest of the day.
Really fun.
Enjoy your day.